Hey guys, Sam Millard from Panhandle Precision. Welcome to the first ever episode of Straight Talk. Straight Talk is all about me answering questions that you've sent in to me via email or PMs or what have you. In the first episode, we're going to talk about canted rails and how we use them for long-range shooting. Okay, all a canted rail does is it allows us to take full advantage of turret travel in our scope. So, whether or not you need one kind of depends on how far you want to shoot and what kind of scope do you have. So if you have a scope that doesn't have a whole lot of travel, then it doesn't really make any sense to put a rail on it. In fact, if you put too much of a slope in that rail, you wouldn't be able to zero it. So instead of using graphics and fancy charts and stuff, I'm just going to try to lay this out as simply as I can. When you start with a scope and a barrel that are perfectly parallel to each other, then you're basically going to be in the center of that scope's elevation travel to get it 100 yards zero, because it's a pretty flat trajectory and both surfaces are pretty lined up. Now when you add a slope to this, or a cant, so that you tip the back of the scope up and the front of the scope down, what you're doing is you're forcing, when you look through that scope again, you're forcing the barrel up to stay in that center line of the scope. So necessarily we'll have to turn the scope down so that we can level that barrel back out again to get 100 yards zero. Now I know this sounds backwards, but on a scope like this, when you dial the turret up, you're actually forcing the reticle down inside the scope, so that when you look at it, you have to elevate the barrel up to see the crosshair on the target. That's just how they work. So when you look at this canted rail, it looks backwards, because it's not intuitive to think that if you point that down, you're going to get a lot more elevation travel, because it looks like you'd have to turn the scope back up to get to zero. It's exactly the opposite. So when you take a 40-minute rail, you're basically adding in 40 minutes of elevation travel into the scope, because we have to turn the scope down 40 minutes from the center line to zero it back out. Now, like I was saying before, it has a lot to do, it has everything to do with the elevation travel, the total amount of travel that the scope is capable of. So this Night Force ATAC-R is kind of at the top of its class. It has 120 minutes of total elevation travel. So when it's centered out, it's at 60 minutes up, 60 minutes down. So when I added this 40-minute rail, it made me zero it by taking away 40 minutes of the down, because why would you ever need any 40 minutes down? So we took that 40 minutes down and kind of added it to our from center line to the top. So now I can dial the scope 100 minutes up. In fact, I've tested this, and this will get me to 102 minutes from 100 yards zero when I have a 40-minute rail in there. Now on the other side of the gun here, let me push this forward. This is a Bushnell Engage. This is their new Engage scope, 4-16. It has a 30 millimeter tube, and it has 60 minutes of total elevation travel in the scope. So when it's centered out and 0 to 100 yards on a flat plane, it's going to be about 30 minutes up and 30 minutes down. So it wouldn't work for me to put a 40-minute rail on this gun. So on this Savage 260, I have a 20-minute rail. So what that did was it added in 20 minutes to my elevation travel. So now I can get actually 50.5 minutes of elevation from 100 yards zero with this scope. Now a lot of the questions I get asked have to do with what rail should I get, meaning what brand. I don't have a whole lot of experience with different brands. All of mine that I have right now, with the exception of some special mounts, are Night Force steel rails, and they come in 20s and 40s, and that's all I've ever used. Other than one, I think it was a Near Manufacturing, one Near Manufacturing 10-minute rail on a Cooper long range that I did a review on, and that rail worked fine too. Some of the other options out there are mounts. So what they are is a canted mount set that is a ring unit and the mount, so you don't have a rail, but they're canted down, so you still get your 20-minute cant. DE, Defensive Edge, makes a good set of those. I believe Hawkins Precision makes those, as well as some other guys. So anyway, you're not limited to any one rail, but I've always had really good luck with these Night Force rails, so I just keep using them. So one of the follow-up questions I get a lot about when we start talking about canted rails, 20-minute rails, 40-minute rails, and what have you, is that do I have to do anything at all in my ballistic calculator to offset that? No, you do not have to do anything at all in your ballistic calculator. It doesn't know that you have a canted rail and it doesn't care. All it's going off of is the center line of your turret here and your 100-yard zero to figure out the trajectory. So it doesn't care how the scope's tipped on top of the receiver. It just doesn't matter. So let's go back over this really quick. The canted rail just adds however much that cant is back into our elevation travel of our scope. So if we have a 40-minute rail and 120-minute total travel in our scope, now we're going to have about 100 minutes of travel to make that scope, to take advantage of that scope when we're shooting long range. Be careful when you pick your rail that it doesn't overrun the total elevation travel, the maximum amount that you can actually turn that scope. So if you have a turret that will only go up and down 40 minutes total, you cannot put a 20-minute rail on it. You might be able to put a 20-minute rail on it, but you're going to be bottomed out, and depending on how high your scope is above the rifle, you might not be able to zero it. So if I had a 40-minute scope, I would probably put a 10-minute rail or a 0 MOA rail on it. Alright, well that was episode 1 of Straight Talk. I don't know how many of these I'm going to do or what the frequency is going to look like, but look for more in the future. If you liked it, please like and share the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.